just lied to the commission.
Okay, so summary of good news. RO Crate has now been funded for, is being funded to
do this data citation piece.
And I'm going to, because I don't know how the recording does with chat, I'm going to repost the link so that we all remember where it is. Okay, we have a real meeting. We're having a real meeting. A real meeting is happening. I'm so excited.
If I got a microphone that works, just before we start.
All right. Does anyone else have news they'd like to report? It doesn't have to be as exciting as that, but
I could report something. Just very briefly on our AGU, it's no longer a union session. I can never remember what that thing is called. Anyway, so I'm working on the timings. We have like 3 hours and 40 minutes for yes, we're open science and fair data for AGU, and I'm super excited. So that is cranking along, and we're going to have an awesome session.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
I could show the use case work that James and I did in terms of where we're at and how immature we are, but conceptually we're getting closer.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And yeah, I was a little afraid when I suggested that you and Martina go through your use cases and you disappeared. I was thinking, oh, well, Justin doesn't want to.
I had a couple of technicals that I had to work through.
Yeah. No, I think that would be great because given that I had a lot of questions as I went through it, I think anybody trying to put together then an example of technologies that could address that is going to have similar questions.
Shall we do that now? Shall we?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Just get my screen up. James, if I miss anything or I miss a detail, just pipe in. James and I put this together between us. So we actually, bit remote, bit unremote in terms of working. We put it together between us so I'll go for that screen. And then we'll make that live. Should be getting my web browser, hopefully. Is that working?
We see a presentation.
Perfect. So James and I, we kind of worked through the concepts we've been going through in previous iterations of this.
Hey, Justin, can you go into presentation mode?
Sure.
Thanks.
Is it Shift F5? Isn't this one? Or is it %? Okay. How's that? Here it comes.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Perfect. So we've actually kind of worked through some of the material we covered already, and we tried to tie it to the use case we've got and where we're heading. And the slides kind of tell a story from how we receive the data to how we disseminate the data. And we added a little bit to it today as well, which might help clarify things for people. As a data center, we receive accessions of data from scientists. And that accession may be a set of samples that come off a research cruise. It might be multiple sets of samples or observations in what we call an accession. And
Justin,
in order, yeah.
Just a moment. Your sound has gone in and out twice now. Could you just like push wires in just in case? It was just went out for a second, but I feel like what you're saying is so important that we don't want to miss even a second.
So I have the feeling we just killed him.
I feel like I missed this. I should have kept my mouth shut.
Wow, I thought that was just me.
No. I think what happened, because he said the reason why he dropped off and come back was because he was having mic problems.
Oh no.
Justin generally has mic problems, and he then unplugs, and then you get a bit of a fan noise outside normally. If
We
you,
can live with that, but I think his screen just locked up to some degree.
yeah, I think
'cause-
he's now completely lost out of it. Do you want me to take over as to where
yeah,
we?
except for Shelley, I think that would have. I think we'd have to get him out of share mode, which I think
Zoom's
you
not
can do.
responding. Yes, I must do a thing. Okay, so, stand by. Oh, Justin, he's still
So
sharing.
Justin, I think you can hear us. We're going to
hang
get
on,
you out of
I-
share mode so that
I
James
got
can share.
the I just forced him to stop sharing. Okay, there we go.
Okay, I'll just nudge him on Slack.
Oh, Carol, yes, we'll do a GoFundMe to get Justin.
Where are we?
I'm sure this has happened before, even in one of this meetings. So he needs the new.
Well,
sure
now
we-
we know why he hasn't been speaking up as much.
Oh man, who knew?
So yeah, where we're at. So what we do is we receive data
Can
from
you share?
Are you not seeing that?
No, I think you might have skipped the
No.
last step of hit the share button.
No,
Oh.
we can't see your slides, James.
Stop share. New share. We'll go screen
Oh, here comes
2.
Justin. Justin's coming back.
Share. Can you see that?
No, you must have 2 screens.
I have 3.
3, super. Even.
It's because I'm a laptop hot desking, so it just plugs in. Okay, that's weird. It's not sharing.
Oh, Justin's
it.
back.
Yeah.
Well,
Should be back.
there we
Okay.
go. Justin's
There
doing
we
it
go,
again.
Justin Drive.
Yay, Justin.
Sorry, a bit of a. Okay, if it, microphone goes just saying I'll flip to one. There's a bit of background noise on the one I'll flip to, but bear with me. So. in
Right
the
from
form,
here. Yep, this is it.
exceptions. They have various different granularities, but the fundamental thing is the data we receive from scientists is.
Justin, you've got.
Justin, we're going to send
So,
you some new mics.
How about Justin? How about Justin shares the slides and James talks?
Okay, I'll talk. Justin, just jump in if there's something I missed. So yes, we receive data in various granularities, whether it's a set of discrete samples, a profile, a transect from a cruise, experimental data. But fundamentally, what we'll do is we'll receive data and we'll want to put a DOI on that accession of data, and therefore it's in the form from the originator. It's linked to that data that we received in that file format and style, and all the data in the values that they provide. Just in next page. Because what we then do is we'll ingest the data and we'll make it machine readable. And what we'll do is we'll put a PID on the granularity that we serve the data in. So generally with time series, this is likely to be a profile. So we'll have a number for a profile, or if it's a discrete measurement, we'll have for the specific sample a measurement ID. And these at the moment are just pseudo PIDs. So they're internal reference numbers that we use that could be made to be registered PIDs. We have an example of a PID there. Yeah, that's a series number that we have.
So James, is it always a subset of what's in a DOI, or is sometimes that PID referring to something more than one DOI?
It could refer to more than one. So if we had a set of discrete samples, they could refer to more than one PID, more than one DOI. But generally, they will be subsets. So yeah, they could theoretically be many to many, but more often than not, they are one to many relationship of PID, more PIDs to DOIs. So it's not exclusive. Yeah, so it could
No,
be many to many.
that's helpful. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, so yeah, we have these numbers which we want to turn into a PID, and that's the reference number, and each one is unique in terms of what it is. So Justin, do you want to go back to the presentation? And effectively, what we then have is different people want different data and different, again, different granularity, spatial, temporal. So within one DOI, you might have several PIDs, and they'll cover different timescales. And with that, someone might want to then use several PIDs from different DOIs and amalgamate them together. So Justin, I think that's the next slide, isn't it? Yeah, you could someone comes in, selects these PIDs, and these are delivered through machine, through web services, etc. Next slide, Justin. They're brokered. They can even be brokered to higher level data delivery or further products. So something like CDataNet, where they amalgamate a load of these PIDs, broader and larger aggregators, super aggregators, and they collect all these data. And again, it might not be all the PIDs because they're only collecting for what they cover or what they want, what they're interested in, what they're funded for.
So James, in
Yep.
your picture, it's always 1-to-1 in there. Is that the case?
No. So the DOIs, there's multiple PIDs to those DOIs, but underneath the PIDs are, the PIDs that are carried through are 1-to-1 because they're the same granularity that we're serving.
Okay.
Now, someone could theoretically split that PID, but we wouldn't. That they could then split that into several. So if you have a time series, you could, every data cycle within that time series could theoretically be split up in. So you have 100 data points for a profile that's going down through the ocean column. That could theoretically be split up into each data cycle, but that's not to us, that wouldn't be a reasonable way of splitting the data. But someone could theoretically do that, but then they'd have a subset of that PID.
Okay, but the PIDs that you're talking about in data collections don't change when they get to data delivery. They're the same PIDs.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
This just sort of serves the different users collecting different sets of PIDs, different collections of PIDs, and again, there is that route back through the DOI that you can see there that ultimately they still stem from that DOI, so they're versions of those DOIs that were published to begin with. Next bit, Justin. So within that, what we want is to be able to aggregate these PIDs. So the data provided by DOI, the PIDs is then aggregated. It could then also be aggregated into a DOI because someone creates a product, they say what they've done, they've probably manipulated the data, applied further QC or further analysis on a broader spectrum. They could then create a DOI, but you'll still be able to you'll have this aggregator that tells you what the PIDs are that we used for that DOI, and that also still gets you back to the original DOIs if you needed to. But you have the PIDs that we used for the aggregation built into that PID, or that, and you could get that aggregator to then be able to cite those PIDs that we used. And if you're adding
the PIDs are citable entities.
That's what we want. We want these PIDs registered. At the moment, we don't. They're not PIDs. They're pseudo PIDs. They're numbers that we have internally. But ideally, what we'd want is these to be, referenced PIDs. And you could then also, I said about additional QC. If you're having code that then tidies up these data, you can combine that with the code that was used, and you can build up the layers that you're doing to create these products to then aggregate and say how you got to this end product. So our solution, this was based on some of the conversation that we had last time, where we were saying how some people would still want URLs. So we wanted to keep it simple to start. So we have this data collection of PIDs. What we want is we put it in a reliquary. So what we have is the PID, so the PID itself, whatever convention that is, the ID name or description, so some sort of free text. As Stian last time was saying, how you'd still want some sort of human element to understand it, and the URLIN that relates to that PID. And then we thought that we'd make them mandatory to start with, to keeping it, trying to still keep it simple. And then we have the comment, the reliquary creator, so we have some sort of basis of knowing how or who has created this reliquary, and the reliquary creator type. If we had a type of reliquary, if that was the case, and it'll be one row within this sort of collection, one row for each PID. So therefore, you have this long list that aggregates it all together.
So how do you build up the citation of the PID?
The citation, well, we were saying we didn't want it to necessarily be similar to the sort of naming convention of the DOI, so it would be some sort of number or unique reference. You wouldn't necessarily have a citation text, it would be a sort of like a DOI.
Okay.
Like a number that just resolves to what this is.
Citation text is really arbitrary. It's the PID. But the problem, though, and this is a tiny bit in the weeds, and we can dig in on this later, is when you're trying to validate those PIDs in some sort of validation methodology, what we find is that those PIDs, if you just change one number, there's another PID with that number, and it's valid. So in reference sections for papers, they actually use the other elements of the citation to validate. They use the title, they use the authors. So you might want to include some other stuff as you have here, just to be able to have a good validation.
And I guess one other aspect that makes me a little bit worried is that this PID scheme, unless you have an outside authority where you're going to also register those PIDs and what they mean, has potential to be fragile in the sense that if for some reason your repository goes away, then those PIDs are no longer able to be blown back out to the DOIs.
We're looking at generating the PIDs via the European Open Science Cloud, and that architecture will be transferable. So effectively, it should give us long-term persistence on those.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I think since we last spoke, I left DataSite, so I'm not sort of singing the DOI song for everything I say anymore. Of course, I still like them, but listening to this, it feels a little bit too complicated. So I think it's fine to use more than one PID type, but I think there should be a very clear story that that there is some, this is how it works. So you just use DOIs here, and here use PIDs, and they're always one kind of PID and have certain criteria, and hopefully other people have a similar approach. Because it all makes sense, but it feels a little bit too. So why do you use another PID type, for example, and not use a DOI here as well? That's not totally clear to me.
It's effectively the amount of work required to create that many DOIs, when we can use an epic ID or a handle which has lighter metadata, is easy to manage, easier to automate. And the DOIs need to be on the elements that people cite, so on the reliquary, on those underlying accessions, and on any products. So we're trying to make the process more efficient and automatable, so it's actually maintainable, sustainable. Because to create DOIs for every single element internally, it just isn't financially sustainable.
Oh, that makes total sense. Is this a little bit distinction between a data set and a data download, or depending on what vocabulary you use, that this is sort of, it's a different use case and that you need a different kind of PID.
I've heard this with in bioinformatics, the minutes are like an identifier that's used for sort of more granular data. So in the similar sense, right? Like they assign all these sort of minute type and identifiers for all this sort of granular data, and they have to because of just the load. So
I was about to raise the same thing, Chris, that yeah, the mini dark IDs, aren't they, that they use particularly for intermediate results, and they're kind of bagged together. They use the DOI in order to almost kind of snapshot. It's kind of, this is an object I'm now releasing that I want people to cite. And the minutes are used as a way of creating identifiers that I can still resolve. So they're not accession numbers. So they're still kind of behaving like identifiers, but they're kind of more for internal handling, as it were.
Yeah, the other thing that we were thinking of this is the way that you can actually bring in it's not just data. So with PIDs, you can do standing operating procedures. You could put a PID on the documentation about the SOP or the certified reference material, with the RRIDs and ORCIDs and things. You can actually start to bring in a wider element of these things together that aggregate. But I think that comes to your point, Shelley, of you want was it Shelley, or you wanted the type that might help validate some things as well.
Okay, well, this makes sense. And where I was looking for the word is DCAT as an example for a vocabulary that has this distinction. And is that sort of going in this direction that, if so, then that makes sense to me. It's just that, yeah, it has to be really clear that not some people use DOIs everywhere and others use different identifiers, and that everybody has their own identifier. And I also like the part with mini IDs that there is a sort of central registration, even though it's sort of lightweight, but still you find something about this identifier outside of the repository. And it's sort of, there's a, yeah.
I think the key thing is that when we end up with this situation, this type of solution, we need to publish the graph so people can then use and interrogate the graph, and we can then extract the metrics, which is a kind of a later slide, from that graph as well. Because if we don't have a clear way of publishing that graph, people aren't going to know how we're constructing things and how to actually use the information.
Well, and it's clear to me this isn't just in bio, because we've been dealing with this thinking about sample IDs. Right, we're getting them, the iSamples project is starting to unify those, but those are something that we also want to be a citable entity, probably ideally also in a reliquary.
Oh, I mean, that makes total sense, but it also sounds scary, because if you now have all kinds of entities in there, that adds another layer of complexity. Examples is very close. I mean, yeah, it makes sense, but if you cannot assume this is all data in various sort of sliced in various ways, then there's extra effort to understand what you have there and what to do with it, etc.
No, I agree, and we're going to want to start simple and just prove that we can take something really that we think is trivial and make it work. But I'm just pointing out that this idea of the PIDs, we're already seeing it in our space as well, where there are going to be other types of PIDs that we are wanting to be able to cite.
But I guess my question then is, should we say right now, it's essential for the reliquary to work that you have different content types in there, and it's just the way it is? If you sort of limit yourself to data sets, it's simple, but it's also doesn't address what people need.
So actually, Martin, I've actually been advocating for that we have different types of data in there. I mean, that's not just data from the beginning, because we've talked about having an ability to include software and paper citations as well, right? If I wrote a tech report about the whole thing that I was doing that never fully published, but I have it available somewhere, on a long-term URL, that would be another thing you should be able to cite.
Yeah, and we don't have to ask Carol, because she will say arrow crates, of course, are essentially whatever you want to put in there.
Well, and identifiers for anything, right? So we have identifiers for SOP. I'm surprised that you mentioned SOPs don't necessarily have DOIs. I use plenty of SOPs with DOIs. So I think there's a bit of an orthogonal thing going on here between the identifier you use for the type and what kind of identifier it is, because you can use DOIs for many of these things, and indeed we do. We use them for software, we use them for workflows, we use them for all sorts of things. And I think it's something we have to ask ourselves, what are the properties of a PID that make it not a DOI? Is it just money, or is it actually things like the ability, the metadata or the mutability of metadata? Are we going to have things that we could cite, but they might change their metadata or not? These are the kinds of things I think we're kind of dancing around, but we're not actually really jumping into.
Well, when I was still at data side, I came to the strong opinion that there is things where DOIs are the wrong thing, and other people have said this for a long time. Just take something like the nucleated database. So if you have machine generated data, you have this in biomedicine, of course, you have this in environmental sciences, where the idea to deal with metadata for these things sensors somewhere, it's just impossible. It's not the numbers, but it's also that there's no human interaction. So the idea that there are more lightweight things that have sort of more basic provenance makes total sense to me. I think right now it's a little bit fuzzy where the boundaries are, but that there is things that you just want to stick in automatically in some workflow that makes sense, and that DOI would be the wrong pit would also make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And then you swizzle them to DOIs when you decided that there's something worth sharing outside the borders of the process.
And the other natural example that we've got that's coming in the UK is effectively cameras on the seabed and cameras on autonomous vehicles. They measure terabytes of images in a single deployment. That's effective, and then there's millions of images, and we put those on. We're going to be putting those in high volume storage for serving. That collection of images for that particular deployment will have a DOI associated with it. Each image within there will have a PID associated with it, and that PID will then be used in reproducible workflows that are used to actually determine species and seabed types from that data. So effectively you're creating AI and machine learning algorithms to actually identify species and seabed type automatically. They can refer to the PID, refer to DOI, so you've actually got a reproducible workflow from that. And that's kind of what's coming, but it wouldn't be putting a DOI on every single one of those millions of images that come off that deployment. At the moment it's not practical to do, but we do need to be able to identify those images and resolve those long term, because if there's a misidentification or those data are used, for example, by EU policy, because if they're being used to, they're going to be used to monitor the seabed around oil decommissioning, then they need to be able to always get back that image, even if it's sitting on tape, and then the tape will get pulled and they get the image back. I don't know if that helps.
So Justin, that helps a lot. That's why my question of whether a PID can contain data from multiple DOIs, because one of the ways I had been thinking about this for the aggregate, for the reliquary, is that there was always an outer container DOI, and then you might have PIDs inside of it that you were, identifying as being the components of that DOI that in fact were the thing you're citing. And the fact that you all said, no, actually a PID could also have multiple DOIs kind of blew that one apart a little bit. So it was very useful to have had the chance to ask that question.
Sorry if I'm annoying here, but I said it in one of our earlier calls. I think simplicity is a good driver, and maybe I also just haven't sorted it out all in my head. Do we want to have a standard PID for this category of use cases, so not every repository comes up with their own solution, whether I use mini IDs or something else?
Would that be wonderful?
At mini ID specifically, I remember when we were in a project with them, meaning in NIH Data Commons, and I think it wasn't clear to me whether they are sort of interested in following this in the long run. So I'm not sure mini ID is as mature that it's just one of the identifiers you can use and they have a sort of certain level of adoption, or whether if not, I haven't talked to those folks recently, whether there is something that can be reused or something that needs to be generated, etc. Because if you say use a PID DOI for citation and other things and use PID XYZ for this part of it, I think that would help me. It's an easier to tell story.
I think
Yeah,
so if I can, I'm gonna break in for a time check. Is there anyone who has to leave at an hour in?
No.
Okay, good. Then we can keep, because I definitely want to get through both use cases, and I don't want to have too much of this conversation before we get through the use cases. So maybe if we can get back to the use case, let's try and get through a bunch of that and let Martina go. So then we can be talking in the broader context of both those use cases.
James, because I don't trust my mic.
Sorry, the use case.
So back to you, James.
For the other use case of the high volume, I think Justin covered that, didn't you, Justin? Just now with so the secondary goal PID for metrics. Yeah, again, Justin raised that in terms of being able to go back. So it's important to then be able to find the metrics to then justify or to inform how the data were used and what was used and how, and you could then start building, data of importance or how many products they used in and things like that. So that would build on some of the work that's already going on with Scholix, etc.
I think that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot from us. Then if because you was talking about Martina's example, if that.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful, Martina, if you're willing to go through your use case, and then we can spend as much time as everybody has to talk about the challenges of these use cases. And since mine isn't yet available as slides, I can just inject where I see differences in the conversation when needed. But I will get mine out now that I'm starting to understand this terminology better. So Martina, are you?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I just try to share the screen. I guess you can see it now.
We do. Can you? Yep.
Okay.
And I see you're going into perfect.
So yeah, I have tried to take up as much from the excellent example we've just seen, and I hope I haven't messed up some of your ideas. So I decided to have one introduction slide just to introduce what we do in the IPCC FAIR guidelines and introduce some of the players, because we are not one center, there are different layers. So going to the IPCC, we have what we call input data, so the data that is analyzed to create figures and the baseline statements. So we have these input data, then the software, the analysis itself, and the final data, which you see in figures of the report. What we also do, which is not that interesting maybe, is that we cite the data. For IPCC that is new, but for us, we do it for a long time. The documentation of the data which was used is based on figures. So there will be supplementary material which is giving information how figures were created with all the different aspects of input data, scripts, and the final data. The partners in the whole thing are, so we have the IPCC with the report, so that's more or less text. We have the different kinds of data which are stored in different repositories which make up the IPCC Data Distribution Center. So we have 4 partners now, and the scripts are archived in Zenodo, and there we have one part of the whole thing. The input data that I will present in the use case comes from CMIP6, so the Coupled Model Intercomparison project, with 150 participating numerical models, a decentral data dissemination, so that's a federation. So how do these CMIP6 data looks like? So we have contributions from different modeling centers for specific climate scenarios, and this consists of a lot of variables and can be cited together because it's created in one model run. So we have many data sets within these DOIs. Every data set is also attached a handle ID. So if I recall our discussion on why handles and why not DOIs, I would say it's the same as Justin mentioned, that it's not the level where you cite, because it doesn't make sense if you have if you want to characterize the climate at a certain point in time and with a certain scenario, it doesn't make sense if you have one variable. You always have a bunch of variables to characterize that. Secondly, we decided for handles because we have replica and we use the handles also for the replication process and to register the replicates that we have around at different centers or at different ESGF nodes. Just looking what I have written here. Yeah, that if you look in the
Martina,
numbers, yeah, sure.
Just a quick question. Are you saying at the replica they have a different handle? Or they're using the same handle to indicate it's the same data? Okay.
Yeah, same handle, 2 locations. Yeah, a couple of numbers. So we have 2,400 DOIs or contributions from different modeling centers, and about 5 million data sets or handle IDs. Yeah, maybe I can mention that our data sets on which we have handles are composed of more than one data set, which also has a handle ID, but we usually say data set handles are the lower granularity on which we on which you can access data. If you analyze in a model intercomparison study, so what also the IPCC authors do, you select specific variables out of different contributions. So you have, say, 5 modeling centers, 3 ensembles each, where you get out the same variable which you want to analyze to characterize the future climate. So what's mainly interesting here is that a small subset of every DOI is used to create these bunch of input data sets, which are used to, for instance, create one figure in the IPCC report. So it's a recombination of different data sets. Of course, the IPCC might use additional data sets in a figure, for instance, a comparison with observations. So then you get from a totally different project and provider additional data sets, which might have DOIs or other kinds of PIDs on it. And the last step is that we have additionally the scripts which create the final data or the figures in this one supplementary material for one figure. I would tend not to mix up the different types. I would just make a reliquary for all the input data sets, so from different providers, and leave code and final data separate. One thing is that the code and the final data is created by the authors, so I would split that. And if there should be one reliquary on code and final data, that could be discussed, but I would keep the input data in one. And this, the report part of it. So in the end, as I said, there are different figures which will, or there are different chapters in the report. The report itself and the individual chapters will have a DOI, at least in the digital version. And in one chapter and one of these cross-ref DOIs, you have the different figure or table with the different information, which I've presented on the slide before. So that's the overall view of the part 1 assessment report, what we are putting together right now.
And those go in the supplementary info?
Yeah. And only in the digital version, just not to make the report too large. So in the report, there's only one annex with all the information which CMIP6 data sets or DOIs have been used within the report. So the citation is there, but not the detailed provenance information. So that's only in the digital version.
So this effectively gives an entirely reproducible IPCC report to build confidence in science, which is incredible. I think, if I'm understanding
I would say it's the last step from input data sets to the figures. So recreation of figures is the idea that we have, but it looks like we won't get the required information from every chapter because the burden was quite high and the whole process started in parallel. So it wasn't really integrated into the different steps. So, well, IPCC is very formal. So you have a first order draft which undergoes a review. You have a second order draft which undergoes a review, and the data came in for the final government draft, I think, FDG. So it was a bit late for the authors to really contribute that information and take the time for it. So we are a bit struggling to go halfway, to have the data and not for all the chapters and figures, the precise and detailed information how it was produced. So we will get halfway.
Still a huge advance. It's amazing.
it's really a huge effort because of the size of all the people involved and the number of figures and pages that we have. And the
Yeah,
few
that's an
people
incredible undertaking.
Yeah, the working group 1 TSU was very ambitious and is now really struggling a bit. Yeah. Here on the last slide, that's more a view on the requirements to analyze where the data came from and who needs to get credit. So if you reuse the data, like you have the query in maybe a handle ID or a DOI where you have all the information on input data sets which went into one figure, then there are parts from different origins. We have the CMAP6 data with a DOI maybe, or no, it's exactly for CMAP6 we don't have the DOI, we just have the handles which are part of a DOI. So it's really a bit complicated. And there might be some other input data like observations which have directly DOIs on the input data for the figure. So, and there might be other PIDs used which has parts, which is more, I don't have an example for it, but I envision that we have the same use case as I think Justin presented, that there might be some data sets used which have DOIs or PIDs, and underneath they have other input data DOIs or something. I don't have the full view what is analyzed there, but I could see that something like that might be the case as well.
Martina, is this still too early so that you're focusing on how to make all this work, or do you already can say, have some feedback, like it's too ambitious, or this works really well, or here they have to sort of adjust? I don't know, in this sort of gigantic undertaking where you are at this. I mean, if you're just sort of focused on little pieces to do the next step, then maybe the big picture comes later. I don't know.
I think we have bits and pieces there. It's just not that we have it for all the figures. We certainly won't have reliquary handles or something. We really have these long lists in the supplementary materials in this round. But for the next round, if we want to have a real citation of the data in the caption of a figure, then we need some abbreviation. We need some handle ID which says this was all the input data and which resolves somewhere. It sits here and links to the different repositories where it is stored. So that would be a use case there, because otherwise it will be invisible or in the digital parts or whatever.
But I guess, put it simple, you think you're on a good path and you want to continue, because I mean, I think it's not only that this is a lot of work to do, but it's also the sort of what you're describing is also super complicated. So maybe it's fine to spend a lot of time. It's worth it for these data to make it more complicated than if you just have sort of long tail data that are fairly straightforward, which are other use cases for the relevant query.
I haven't catched the question.
Well, the question was, what you presented is what you're doing, but also you're continuing doing this, and it's the path you have, or the decisions you have taken. I mean, not you personally, but going in this direction, which is, I think, different from somebody is sort of exploring the possibilities and no idea what will end up in going forward.
Yeah, I think we did it a bit different, that we're focusing on transparency and provenance rather than on citing the data. So the idea was to have more transparency on how figures were created and not primarily to cite the data. Maybe that's why we ended up a bit differently.
I think in the long tail question, the data that we ingest in BODC, we don't ingest the long tail data. The long tail data would end up staying in just the initial DOI, and it won't get broken down into PIDs and go any further. So with this use case, we focus on the high value data that we can actually get across and out to communities. But to me, the model looks very similar. It's just at a different level. You could potentially connect the PIDs generated by us to the base of Martina's graph and go all the way through, which would be and then if that gets cited by government policy, you can then literally go from government policy right the way through to the source data, which is spectacular transparency in policy.
Oh my God, Justin, your hum just went away.
Did you understand did what I say make any sense?
Yeah, no, we can hear it. It just literally now your mic is working great.
It depends on the laptop fan. That seems to be the switch.
Oh, it's the laptop fan. Okay. So Martina,
at the beginning, my AirPods broke because one was connected to my phone and one was connected to the laptop, and everything exploded.
Yeah, no, I've had that problem. The latest Mac update has killed the airport or the AirPods. I can tell you that. Okay, so Martina, I love this example because it's sort of the super complex version of some of my examples, and it actually convinced Martin that sometimes we need this level of complexity because it's that important.
Well, it's IPCC, so that's like the thing that is important right now. So I think whatever it takes, and if it's complicated, so be it. I mean, I'm more awed at this than the complexity of people flying in space because they are billionaires. I mean, that's a sort of space travel used to be, oh, that's the coolest and craziest thing you could do. But no, this is much more exciting or important.
And we are working on a voluntary basis, the authors, and so it's yeah, especially the authors, the TSU and some of the DDC stuff has gets funded for that, but most of the authors do that voluntarily. So yeah.
I was very interested, Martina, in your statement that your primary use case was transparency and tracking rather than citation. I think that's very interesting, actually, to see are they actually the same when it do these things actually come down to the same sort of pattern that you need, or are there different properties that you need in our reliquary PID pattern? Because they have different intents, but they might come out with the same framework.
Yeah, exactly, because basically it's the same what you're doing. If you're citing something, you make it also transparent what you have used.
Mm.
I have been nagging about this. If you look at the FOSS 11 data citation principles, you have both in them. Mm. So something has to be citable and something has to be, I don't know what the exact language is, but for me, they are going in sort of 180 degrees different directions, because one is about very fine granularity. You want to see exactly what this is for transparency, whereas for the citation, it's usually let's lump everything together because we don't want to lose citation juice. And then you are like, when you have 10 versions, it's super important that which version are we talking about in this figure to understand what it is. But for citation and for credit, etc., it's the other way around. So I see them as sort of siblings. So not the same thing, but having different use cases. And what annoys me in the data citation principles, the citation comes before the transparency. in this, I mean, I don't know whether there's a strict ordering number 1 to 10, but I think it's 2 and then 7. So it's almost an afterthought. Oh yeah, you want to be able to reproduce what you're showing there. I think it's really nice, Martina, that you put the priorities differently.
I think one thing which is also different is that we want to capture provenance, not only the components, this is the software and this is the input and the final data, but as much as we can also how the software was applied. So we have one tool which is developed by a consortium which does that. It really has a detailed provenance information to say who ran that with which data sets, which version of the script, and bring, and yeah, it's more bringing all the information in context, how the different components were used to create the figure. And one sentence to transparency, that's really something more coming from the institutional level. So IPCC needs a level of transparency for its integrity. So that was something which came more from that direction than from the authors. But it was supported, of course, from the working group one co-chair. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible to do that.
I think the transparency comes from the need. We need to have transparency in the scientific record. And one of my former mentors, before they retired, told me that when we went digital, we entered the dark age, because all of a sudden, when we ceased to have the ability to create a transparency in the work that we do, because it wasn't citable and you didn't have an audit trail going back. And what we're fundamentally doing now is we're actually re-engineering the audit trail we had before science went digital.
I think that's a very interesting point that you make there, Justin, because we had one of the many conferences that's running this week, because there's the eScience conference, there's the Open Science Fair, there's the Meta Science conference all this week. And one of the things that's emerging is reproducibility. It's particularly a red herring. It's really transparency is that people are really after, and reuse. But I think this is very important, this notion of tracking, so to defend and to give trust to what you're doing, I think is important. But we're spending an enormous amount of effort on reproducibility, and it's probably not where the effort should go.
Well, it's a continuum, right? You work towards reproducibility, but you don't always have to get perfect. You could be 80%, but you're very transparent. I think there's a moment where it's not worth the time, but we need, I think that's really interesting that you came up with that. I saw Deb had to take a call, but I'm hoping that she'll start to tie us back together and think through what our next steps should be. There she is. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, I'm back. Since we're about to go on vacation, I have to get a few things done that can't delay. Okay. This has been awesome. Thank you, Martina and Justin, for being willing to go through these cases, because I think they've helped everybody who's thinking about the solutions to have a much broader view of the problem. So this was awesome, really. And I think I'll put together my cases. They're really subsets of Martina's. The other thing I wanted to mention, besides what Martin said about, I love what you said about the difference between when you're thinking about credit versus when you're thinking about transparency, because I think that's dead on, and I hadn't been thinking about that way. I think the other piece of it, though, is also the counting doesn't matter anymore when you're purely worrying about transparency. And the counting becomes really critical when you're thinking about credit. So I think that's the other place where they're different. That are the two obvious places, at least to me. So I think that I'm hoping that we now have that several of you who are thinking about solutions have a much better grounding in the problem and the breadth of the problem. And I still encourage everybody to think about the initial solution. We want to head for simple, right? I mean, we're still on that track. Don't solve the most complicated version of the problem first. I like that Martina only suggested the reliquary was at the very top of her problem rather than at the middle, because I immediately went, well, wouldn't you want to use a reliquary in the middle? And it's like, okay, no, let's try and actually have it just help her with the top. Because if we can do that, we already have sort of bitten off a huge amount of this problem. So like I said, I'll put together mine over the next week. But I think, again, they're a subset of Martina's and Justin's, so I think they're less necessary. And what I'd like to still propose is then that the next time we meet, and let's figure out how much time we need before we meet, that we have proposed solutions that people are going through. And that they're not necessarily fully formed, but where they're starting to be able to say, here's how I think we could put together this reliquary using these particular technologies and using this particular method, where you're starting to show how these use cases would look in that reliquary. Is that reasonable as a idea?
I think for the next one, yes, but there's a clock ticking that worries me slightly. And that is that we're going to be presenting this 2, 3, maybe 4 times at AGU. And there's going to be multiple people presenting this to AGU. And it would be really good if we had a consistent message and thread to what we're presenting in order to get the same thing to as many people and get as much feedback as possible from the community. And we've only got 2 or 3 months on that clock now, and that worries me slightly.
Awesome point, Justin. Which kind of argues for in October we try and have together first views of the types of solutions we can see, and then in November that we meet to sort of bring it all together and create that summary so that we all have the same view of what this looks like. Would that be a reasonable schedule? Because you're right, in December, if we all are showing completely disparate views of this thing, everybody's just going to walk away more confused and more convinced this is not something we ever want to solve.
So you're saying we're solving this problem by the end of the year, right?
We're saying we have enough of a view toward solving this problem that people can see that it's headed in the right direction and doesn't look like a train wreck. That's my goal. It's not that we have it solved.
Yeah, that's fair. 2 comments from the call today, which I really enjoyed again. One is on maybe rephrasing from keep it simple to something that's a little bit more nuanced, because obviously Martina will never find a solution that is simple because her problem is just too complex. But maybe start simple or something that there is a model that can, if you are an organization that has very different needs, that you can do something rather straightforward. But if things get more and more complex, but you also have more and more people and resources involved, that this model allows for nuance, for sort of the crazy use case, which are not 80% of the use case, but they're of course super important. And the other comment is on the pits. That's just something I always come back to. So Martina explained that they use handles, and then we talked about mini IDs, and I wonder whether there is a little bit more work to sort of sort out what the options are and whether it makes sense. Maybe it doesn't, but to say, for example, if we have for this other use case, handles are appropriate, and maybe there's a little bit of work, for example, to agree on if you use handles, what are the metadata you're storing, which is probably more the province metadata than what you do with DOIs. But if there's some sort of breaking down the options, yeah, it didn't sound like the first use case had a specific pit they have developed and invested a lot of time, and that's what they want to use, or what you want to use. Sorry.
We're open to suggestions. So.
So and I'm sure there's other options. ARCs, of course, are sort of fall in this category, and many ideas is sort of built on top of ARCs. So if that's also something we get to at some point, or let's say what you said, that let's come up with a proposal that UI is not good for everything, and for these use cases we identified something where we all want to use X, Y, Z.
Well, and I think maybe starting to go after what are the properties of a PID to enable them to be used. What are those minimum properties that we'd like to see a PID have? And what do you sacrifice when you're missing any of those properties, right? Are you sacrificing transparency? Are you sacrificing longevity? Are you sacrificing citation? Shelley.
So I'm thinking far into the future, like 6 months, where we're going to be having solidified our recommendation. We're going to need people to adopt so that we can get enough of a momentum that people will take this as a methodology going forward, or variations on methodology. And so I have a draft working group charter for RDA so that we can go through the RDA recommendation process. Which means we don't have to necessarily solve all the problems by the time we get to December. We can shape them and then bring in other groups who have PID background to help us, or repository background, or publishing background, whatever we need, and just think that through. Yeah, that's it. That we'll have to consult with others to get full buy-in.
And using the RDA would give it enough gravitational pull to make our organization want to do the development as well.
Yeah. I don't think they're the only group, but I know we need them in our back pocket. And I've already vetted the concept, because we're overarching across multiple working groups there, and coming into RDA in November, I want to be ready to invite them to the conversation. Like data granularity, they need to be with us, and have been in the first 2 meetings, but we need to include them because what we do is going to affect them, impact them, and it would be good to have them part of this. And then, I'm thinking of all the people at Pitapalooza. I can see this be like maybe even a track at Pitapalooza, Martin. I don't know that you're still doing that, but I have Anna from Orchid, not with Orchid anymore, Anna Heredia, is on another team of mine, and I know she would be helpful or for this project for Pitapalooza. Anyway, just letting you know I'm thinking about how to do that, and not to distract you from this current plan. I think it's perfect.
Shelley, how far are you with these writing the proposal for a working group? I know that you thought about putting it into a Google Doc. So the question is, do we want to continue that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think it would be, actually, I'm thinking you, Martina, Justin as a co-chair, and Deb as a co-chair, that essentially these 3 use cases, because and I'm, I can help as well, but if does that make sense for being able to pull it through at RDA? Are you guys okay if I do that?
I'd like to bring James through as well, because we've been working through this together quite heavily. So.
Okay, I'm just thinking of co-chairs. So maybe James is the co-chair. Would you rather have that, Justin?
We can have a look together.
Okay.
It depends, because we're both product owning a lot of projects internally and where we work, so we just got to balance it out.
Okay, all right, great.
And I don't need to be a co-chair.
Oh, I'd like you to be one, just because Deb, without you leading, it takes a village, Deb. It takes a village. But this is going to be very technical, and it's going to have a lot of fingers. And so if the use case folks can stick together, and I don't think there's any reason why both James and Justin couldn't be a co-chair. There's not really a technical reason for that at all. We could do that.
I'm
Okay.
keen to share it if possible.
Keen to share. Okay, that sounds good. Let's just do that and not worry about it. And then what we can do. I think I have the mechanism almost in place to start with, being able to sign up to the RDA group, and we can start to invite folks into that group as well. But I'm also thinking this is very broad. It's not just RDA. We really have to bring in other communities. We have to make sure the Force 11 folks are aware, for instance, because they're weighing in heavily on how citation works. And the publishers need to be aware, because we know we're going to solve problems for them. And the indexers, they're supportive, but they're nervous. This is complexity. They don't like complexity. They like simple things.
I mean, one question I have is, what's the overall goal? I mean, after listening to Martina, she almost convinced me. She convinced me for her use case, but I don't know whether that means for the bigger picture here, whether citation is not a most important thing we want to achieve, but transparency, or, well, let's not use reproducibility because it's so loaded, but that this is actually what we're really after.
It almost seems like that, Martin, right? Like with some of the cases, that it's not just, we heard the case from Justin about sort of the maritime equipment, and like in those cases where you're sort of generating a lot of data, or just a lot of data off these instruments, it's almost like transparency is really one of the things that we're after here.
But we also started off with the idea of mass credit, that in publications you wanted to be able to cite more than 2 or 3 data sets, because you'd used more than 2 or 3 data sets.
Yeah.
And I don't want us to lose sight of it. We can run with 2 kind of broad use cases, can't we? The transparency one and the sort of large credit one, as it were, or mass credit.
Yeah, and I would say that my use case is primarily about the credit, more so than the transparency.
I think
Okay,
it's,
I mean,
it's
I
the
think
same problem, because you run it from one direction, you get transparency. You run it in the other direction, you get credit.
Yeah.
Yep.
So maybe I rephrase this as, if the credit is really more credit for repository, or we need this infrastructure, that's very different than credit for an author for specific work. And the reason I raised this is mainly because of, let's say, frustrations that this data citation train is really moving slowly, and maybe sort of taking a different angle or different look at this can also help to move things forward. That in the end, it's also about citation, but you say maybe we think broader about this, then in the end, in the long run, it might be helpful in different ways. And it's I think we are not saying we want to solve one problem and then the rest we don't care. It's all sort of interconnected, as several have said.
I think it's both and. I think it's both and. I think depending on who, like I'm imagining different stakeholders engaged, and I think depending on who you're talking to, the selling point is different. And having both is critical. And I can also see this as providing momentum. There's very good work happening right now in the journal side on data citation, something I'm almost ready to talk about, but not quite ready to talk about. And when we can lay this ground, we're going to have the attention of journals. And then they're going to say, yeah, but it's still hard to cite data. We're going to say, yeah, we know. By the way, here's how you're going to do it. And, we're going to need help making sure the indexers do the right job with citation, with getting credit. And it's your job to make sure they have the information they need. Oh, great. Good. that's your job. So I think we're going to lay this ground, one stone at a time. But we're about to get some equipment to help it go faster. And I have to tell you, within the Earth and Space Sciences, Martina's use case is gold. Transparency for the IPCC report is gold. And we are going to say that. You
That's
have
one
to
step.
say, yeah, we need to
But
make it easy for her.
Let me just put the citation and the credit in as well, because there's an interest of IPCC to have transparency, but if you're an author of the CMIP6 data, it's more that you want to get the credit by being cited and the data is used in the report. So there is the credit also very important. So it depends on the stakeholder where you look, which of these parts are important.
It's the impact level of the data, which really
governments are about to make multi-trillion-dollar decisions on what happens in their economies, and that's going to be based on reports like IPCC, and you need to have that transparency for it to actually work.
But the other side of that is there's a whole lot of data needed to create that, and a lot of the incentive for bringing your data to IPCC is not just for the good of humanity, but also because you can trace back and get the counted credit of my data was important to figure 5 in chapter 6, and that's a really important figure. I know that sounds almost crazy, but it's the case. I mean, Ameriflux, a lot, some of that's driven, where there's a real desire to be a valuable resource to the IPCC report and to have the credit there for it. So absolutely, I think both are important.
Yep. The other thing that Deb said earlier about including physical samples, I know the iSamples folks are working on a way.
Shelley, we lost you because your phone is instead talking to us.
Oh, really?
I hear you fine.
I can hear Shelley just fine.
I hear fine.
We're fine.
Yeah, me too.
Deb, your phone's ringing.
And now we can't hear you.
For all the time.
Okay, I'm going to keep talking and maybe Deb will figure out.
We still
what's
can't
going
hear
on.
you.
Okay.
I
I
can
can
hear.
hear. I can hear.
Yeah,
I can hear her.
You're
We can.
fine.
Deb, it's
I
your
can't hear any
problem,
of
I
you.
think.
Go for it,
Maybe it was
Shelley.
my phone. Ha!
It's you, Deb.
Okay. Deb, okay.
I
That's
also
weird.
have two laptops, and the other one was also
Ah.
talking.
My phone.
And okay. All right. So, iSamples, right. So, I asked the iSamples folks to please solve the problem with how are you going to cite your physical samples in a paper? And I know they're doing their work without anybody from publication in the team. So I happen to know there are some serious limitations on what they're going to be able to do because, frankly, paper publication is super old and legacy, and there's a lot of barriers and burdens. The solution that we're coming up with here could solve their problem. And when we're ready to actually bring them into the conversation, I think it's going to be a real saving grace that we've considered how to bundle it and include it within a paper without making the paper do something different, which we know they can't do. They just, moving that entire publication community. You could move 1 or 2 journals, but you're not going to move them all. And you need a way for samples to be in all the journals. So this will be a really great extension.
Yeah, I think it would be good in one of the future calls or different contexts to talk more about the sort of our crate angle. The focus today was you have gazillions of data sets and how you bring them together, but package everything that belongs together across the types of content. I think that's sort of something we probably haven't spent enough time on. And I'm not just saying this to please you, Carol, because I know.
No, I appreciate that.
But
I thought about it as well. But I think it was important. These use cases, had implicitly packaging in them, but it wasn't really kind of lifted, but it's there. you can see that it's there. Yeah. Yeah, that would be great. And we've got some use cases now that you can get your teeth into, right? When you didn't have use cases, it's much harder to do it in the abstract. And I think it's also been very useful to have this notion, this discussion about kind of the role of the identifier, because I think we've explored that a bit. And also the big the big differentiators, I guess. They're not such a big differentiator, but the transparency story and the citation story. I think that's been really useful to emerge.
So
I've also wanted to ask my European colleagues, is anybody on the EOSC Association Task Force for PID Policy and Implementation? Because that's the other big 500-pound gorilla in the room, Shelley, along with other things.
I'm going to go hunt them down because I think we need to brief them on what we're up to so that they don't mess us up.
Well, that's what I'm worried about, is messing up.
Yeah. Let's.
Yeah, I will also check at Dika Rosetta. I know that there were an application sent to join the group, and I don't know what came out of it, because we have an expertise on PIDs, so it might be the case that we got on it, but I will check.
Okay, that'd be great.
There are 24 appointed members, and you were only allowed to apply for one of the task forces. Some task forces, 6 task forces took everybody who applied and just said, let's all be open, but others did not. And I think the PID one did not. So I'd be quite interested, Martina, maybe you should do some sleuthing.
Yeah, I got 10 into EOSC. I think I know who it might be.
Yeah, I'm just worried about it becoming a mess. That's what I'm worried about.
We'll follow up on that. And can you believe we're at the end of our 90 minutes? I know, is that Neto? So next steps, Deb. So this is the large group in October, and we walk through the 3 use cases with the large group. We clarify our gaps. And then from October to November, we sketch out a recommendation, at least a first draft. We look at that in November so that we're all talking from the same basic concept in December. We stand up the working group. We start to invite others into the conversation, and we make sure that we're building our base. Your head nodding, Deb, would make me feel much better. Oh, okay.
I was kind of running under a small hope that by October we had people starting to talk about what the solutions start to look like, but I think that's unrealistic, particularly since I'm certainly not working on it in that time.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe Justin and James will help lead, or Martina can help lead on that. I think that's okay. So maybe we'll go a little bit faster than what I said, but I'll do a doodle for October. I'll do a doodle for November. And I'll keep you all in the loop on this working group. It's going to take that'll probably come after fall meeting anyway, by the time it's approved and stood up. So it'll help keep us moving forward and help us connect to other people as well. Does anyone?
Sorry, I do. So you're saying in October we'd bring the whole group, or we'd keep with the small group?
I'm thinking we have to tell people about what we're doing, but maybe we can solidify ourselves more. What do you think? So sounds like you're arguing small group because we're able to actually get through some ideas faster.
Well, if October is primarily presentation of the use cases, then the large group makes sense. If it's starting to present potential solutions, then the small group makes sense. So maybe the large group in October to present the use cases and to talk about the next steps. And then November, we're talking through potential solutions and how we want to present this at AGU. Or do we need the large group to know about how we're presenting this in AGU?
I'm open. What do you guys think?
I like how you split it. I think it's a bad idea to have you sort of focus too early, because we have to have good use cases, but there's probably many more. So having a large group, but if it's about actual work, a large number is not helpful. So what you said makes total sense to me, Deb.
Martin, which one did you like? Small,
Well,
large,
big, then small,
big then small.
then order. And I think that everybody understands that if there are some big plans, that it's not that there's a solution 2 months later. And I think there's other channels to communicate other than having another meeting if it's about keeping everybody in the loop.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think
And
it
then,
also helps if we do the use cases, because if we're presenting it to a big group, we'll have to really get them sort of elegantly nailed down, as it were, and kind of give a unified view of the use cases. And I think that would be useful because the devil's always in the detail, isn't it? And if you have to explain it to another group, that's when you really figure out what the hell am I talking about.
Well, it also gives the larger group an opportunity to contribute additional use cases after that meeting.
Yeah.
Once they see what the format is for how they need to present it, they could then add their own use cases to sort of add to that. Then in November, we're talking about what we think are at least the beginnings of the solutions and how we're going to present at AGU. And that's in the smaller group.
Yeah. Yeah, the use cases were really, really helpful today.
As an aside, I'm started working through the hurdles to figure out if I can go to AGU in person this year, but nothing's confirmed at this stage.
I can guarantee I will not be at AGU in person.
We'll be there. Shelley and I.
Chris and I will be there for sure.
We can hang out with you at a distance.
Also know that I think there's a date in October where you can switch from in-person to virtual or vice versa for just the difference in the fee. And it's the fee at the time you originally registered. So if you did an early bird, you just get the early bird rates, but if you didn't, you'll get the later rates. So I had to dig. It's kind of buried in our FAQs that's happening. But I'm trying to tell people that the risk is low. You can flip back and forth and get a credit or come and yeah. Okay, so large group, October, small group with actual solutions, November, start to work on recommendations, will be solidified, will be consistent, not solidified, consistent in December. We'll start the RDA working group so that we can have an official recommendation sometime in 2022. And then we'll also, so if there's any other groups like the EOS group that Carol mentioned, we need to get them spun in. Pitapalooza needs to get spun in. If there's anybody else that we need to make sure that we brief to and include, please say something.
Just briefly, I think we should say RDA 2023. So that's not super ambitious because usually you have 18 months, and by the time this even gets started, it's already spring for the next plenary. And this EOS group is really a PIT policy, so it's super high level. So it might worth thinking about ES projects that are more hands-on where we are with our stuff. And there is one call that closed this month, which is basically very much about PIT graph and all this stuff, and sort of the usual suspects are involved there. So that's something to reach out to. I mean, there's a few months before this is accepted, but these calls are not very competitive, so you can start talking now.
Invery Fair is a current project with a working group of PIDs, and they're probably the same people. So we could, if we struggle to get through them via the webs, we might be able to get them via the Invery Fair project, which has got 18 months left to run.
And yes, iSamples, I can spin them in. Okay, all right, great. There's a plan. Sorry that I fibbed at 30 minutes. Guess we needed.
Did we write down the plan?
I did type it. I did type it.
Very good.
Yep, I did type it. Here, can we write down the plan?
Well, you'd be surprised the meetings I've been in where people didn't write down the plan.
I'm appreciating you. I just am embarrassed because apparently I didn't write the plan down last time. So large group review of the use cases, October, small group for possible solutions, December, consistent message at fall meeting. And then December, January, So this is our RDA working group and other working groups. This is, I'll reach out to ice samples and everybody earlier than December, January. The EOSC connections, including the PID, whatever Carol called that, working group or whatever they are.
Yeah, I'll dig out that with some of my European colleagues here. We'll find out what's going on.
We need the Fairs Fair and the Giant connection there.
Fairs Fair is winding up soon. It's just a project, but there's something called Fair Impact, which is the follow-on project which was submitted today.
Oh my God.
And what about Go Fair?
Impact. So if Fair Impact is funded, which is led by Ingrid, and it's all the Fairs Fair people again. So
okay,
it's Fairs Fair Mark II.
I'll write her a note then. Yep, we have connections to Go Fair. Chris, I'm going to let you deal with that. Chris is on the US Go Fair team. Shelley with Carol.
Okay, while Shelley's thinking about her notes, I should explain the comment that Shelley made at the very beginning. The point is not just that I'm going on vacation. I'm taking up a new position within the lab that is going to keep me fairly distracted. And that's why she was pointing out that I was maybe not quite as engaged. But I still heavily care about this. I want to show up every time I need to show up. My level of work during the in-between times may drop a bit, which is kind of scary to have to admit, because I wasn't being that good about it in the first place, as you can see. So but I still really want this to happen, and I will do everything that you guys need me to help make this happen. It's incredibly important to our groups.
So Deb, I think what you did is got promoted, and I think you kept all your current work and doubled it, is what happened, right?
I dropped some of my current work, but yes, you're right.
Congratulations. Congratulations. I think that's amazing. So we're more than happy to fill in the gaps as best we can, but it's really hard to fill in your expertise because it's quite unique. So thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you all for all the, this has been amazing. I love this group because I really have the feeling that if we can just stay together for long enough, that we can actually make real progress on this problem. And it just, it feels to me like this can really be game changing in a lot of ways in really bringing data to the fore in a way that papers have held that place. And I think it's just so important to me. So thank you.
Thank everyone. Deb, enjoy your vacation. That seems to be happening tomorrow or something.
Yep. She comes back on October 18th. So the October window will be on the latter half of October, and then likely the November window will be the latter half of November. So watch for those doodles. And does anyone else have anything? Nope. Okay. So random things will come out of the RDA working group. Just roll with it. And as soon as I get that Google Doc, Martina, I'll share it. Oh, things that fall on the floor. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being so flexible and dedicated.
And thanks for organizing this. Don't stick pins in yourself. You're doing great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.